Welcome back, my dear followers, and I want to thank you for taking time to listen to me as I dive into the second source of history. Last time we discussed the source of history, which of course is the oral tradition, and I gave you questions after that for you to go and do your own investigation and empower yourself with knowledge. This time, I want us to look at the second type of sources of history, and that is the written record or records as a source of history. So, what are these when you talk of the written records? These are the accounts that describe the historical events that happened, and they have been put down or documented so that they are used by historians, even non-historians, to transmit the history of a community or of a person. And this source is normally evaluated by historians using historical methods so that what is given out to the public is authentic, to some degree objective. So the written records are the secondary source or documents that give us the history of a particular society. And these documents include things like the diaries, letters, files, specifically government files, newspapers, textbooks that are used in classrooms and also by other people, biographies, academic articles which analyze specific events and the errors. So those are the sources of written records. These written records also include other modern documentaries which basically interpret the historical events, and they can also be termed as reference materials. These include encyclopedias such as Britannica. They also include dictionaries, calendars, directories. All of these that preserve historical information, events, and personal experiences over time act as a source of written record and part of written record as a source of history. They provide detailed chronological and relatively permanent evidence of the past, allowing us or the readers of historical records to cross-reference and to reduce guesswork in historical reconstructions. So that is the written records. Written records are essential for understanding the details of the past civilization, including the politics, the culture, and the economy. As we looked previously, that in history we don't study past events only, we study very many other things. So politics, culture, economy, they form history. So written accounts include all this. These written accounts also offer first-hand accounts that are generally more accurate regarding dates and specific activities or events compared to oral tradition. And remember, there is a question I asked about the disadvantages of oral tradition, and here it is brought out. However, the written sources can also be biased. This one needs to be, you need to relate it to my first issue of understanding history. How do we understand history? So this written record can also be biased, though it can be somehow accurate, but it can reflect the subjective interpretation, the ignorance, or the personal perspective of the author of that book. They may only present the views of the literate people, or they may, for example, if somebody is aligned or is leaning towards a specific personality, a specific system of government, he or she may write glorifying that system and throwing away actually the weaknesses, and that's where the bias of the written source comes in. And then they may also overlook the views of people who do not write or read. That is excluding the views of the ordinary people. Remember, we said in history we study the leaders and the people they lead. So if you only write the views of the leaders and you exclude the views of the people they lead, then your view has become biased. So that is the challenge with the written source of the written records as source of history. So you have understood that briefly, and I want to, before we go to the next source, I want to give you some questions for the written records as source of history. One, examine the merits and demerits of written accounts as a source of history. Two, how do historians use these sources, the written records, to develop history? Three, with examples, examine the biases in written history or written records as source of history. Four, how can an upcoming historian like you who is watching this, listening to me, avoid biases in writing history? So I hope that will help you in that area of written records as a source of history. The next source of history is what we call archaeology. Archaeology is also a source of history. By archaeology, we mean the scientific study of the past human activities through the recovery, the analysis, and the interpretation of various items. What are these items? One, what is what we call physical artifacts. Physical artifacts, they can also be referred to as material culture, which include tools like pottery, buildings, and many others. It also includes cultural ornaments like the beads which people used to wear, the earrings, the clothing, the weapons, and so on. So all those in archaeology, they are studied. So archaeology studies both historic, that is documented, and prehistoric, that is undocumented people, to understand the past cultural practices. It bridges the gap between social science and humanity so that we are able to reconstruct human history. Archaeology is very, very important for us to understand history from a cultural perspective where people did not leave written records. So that means archaeology needs ethical treatment. It needs consultation with the indigenous groups and the preservation of the historical sites. So when you are going to undertake archaeological studies as an archaeologist, so you need to consider that archaeology is also a crucial objective source for reconstructing our African unwritten past, providing tangible evidence of early human evolution, advanced civilizations, and trade networks. By analyzing these artifacts and also the remains of settlements, so archaeology from African perspective helps us to challenge the Eurocentric narratives. Remember, we talked people saying Africans did not have history before the coming of Europeans. So archaeology challenges that. Archaeologically, the first human beings in the world existed in Africa, and we happen to share in that. We have the old Vigoch site in Tanzania, which is not far away from us, and many others. There is one in Ethiopia called Omo Kibish and others. So these evidences show us that history did not begin with the Europeans. So each human society has and continues to have its own history. So archaeology is also a source of history. It helps us to get to know the history of a society. There are all methods used in archaeological studies as a source of history. The archaeologist has to consult the community in which he or she is going to undertake the studies, surveys the site, then after surveying, they excavate the site, they document their findings there. They also do what we call the laboratory testing for things that are found there for carbon dating. So how old has this finding been there? So that's what is called carbon dating in relation to bones and so forth. So, and to classify these things. Yes, archaeology is very important as a source of history, but it also has its own weaknesses. It can be misinterpreted, it can also be manipulated, and the field faces limitations due also to the high costs of excavation and the the destruction of sites. If you are to do your studies in a conflict zone, you may not undertake it. So that is also a limitation in archaeology. So archaeology is very important as a source of history. I hope you have got that. And for you to do more studies, I want to give you some questions, 4 questions in that. The first one is, how significant is archaeology to history? The second question is, examine the limitations of archaeology as a source of history. The third is, discuss the contribution of archaeological sites in East Africa to human history. The fourth is, assess the core areas of archaeology as a source of history. I hope you have got those questions for further studies. Now that we have done the two, written and archaeology, let us go to the third source of history, and that is what we call anthropology. Anthropology as a source of history. Anthropology is the scientific study of human beings, their behavior, and their societies in the past and the present. It is a discipline that aims to understand the complexities of human diversity, including the culture, the social and biological aspects. One of the key concepts in anthropology is the what we call cultural relativism, which recognizes that different cultures have different values, beliefs, and practices, and that these should be understood and analyzed within their own context rather than judged by the standards of one's own culture. For example, if you are a Munyankole, you don't judge the Baganda using your standard of Banyankole. That is what is meaning here. If you are an Acholi, you don't judge a Mugishu based on your Acholi standard. That is what this is saying. I think there is some lesson for us there. If you are a white, you don't judge an African based on your own standard. And that mistake was committed long ago against us by the whites. They were judging African concepts, African things based on their own standards. And that is what anthropology says no. So the relativism perspective has important implications for understanding issues of power, inequality, and social justice, and has influenced the development of fields such as feminism, though they are taking it to far left, anthropology, post-colonial studies, and critical race theories. These are issues anthropology also is reviewing. I think you have understood that. So anthropology provides a unique perspective on the human experience. It emphasizes the importance of cultural diversity, social relationships, and the connections between humans and their environment. Remember, when we are defining history, we said even in history we study the environment in which people live. So you can see from an anthropological view, what we said in the definition of history has come in. So the holistic approach and the focus on understanding the complexities of human behavior and society make it a valuable discipline for addressing many of the most pressing social, cultural, and environmental issues of our time, and historical. That one becomes complex. As I said it, that history is not just the study of past events, it is a complex area. I hope you are getting that from this anthropological perspective. So anthropology is divided into subfields. Before we talk of the historical anthropology, we have what we call physical anthropology, which focuses on the study of human biological and physical characteristics, including genetics, evolution, and human anatomy, which is not really our focus. The second subfield of anthropology is what we call cultural anthropology. This examines the beliefs, customs, and behaviors of human societies. This subfield studies everything from religious practices and social organizations to economics and also political systems. And this one partly is there in history. And then the third is what we call linguistic anthropology. This studies the language and communication in human societies. This includes examining the structures and the use of language, as well as the ways in which language shapes culture and social relationships. You can see how it is related to history. Then finally, we have what we are doing now, archaeological anthropology. This involves the study of human history and the prehistory through the analysis of artifacts and other physical remains. So this is very, very serious for us as we study it and as we look at it, anthropology as a source of history. Anthropology and the anthropologists, they also use a range of methods as we looked at the archaeology. So anthropology also has its method of study, of studying human behavior and culture. This include participation, I mean a participant observation, they observe. Then it includes ethnography, it includes surveys, interviews. These methods allow the anthropologists to gain a deeper understanding of how people live their lives, their beliefs, value systems, and traditions, and how these shape their behavior and interaction with others. So that is anthropology as a source of history. Therefore, anthropology serves as a crucial specialized source of history by reconstructing the past, the undocumented or oral society history through material culture. That is what archaeology does. And then it looks at the language evolution, that's what we call the linguistics, and the human behavior analysis. So unlike traditional history, which often relies on written records, anthropology uses ethnography and the physical remains to understand the cultural and social evolution of the literary societies. An anthropologist will come and stay with you and studies what you do and how you live, and they records that, and it becomes a source of history. So the questions in that area for you are: one, critically examine the significance of anthropology as a source of history. Two, discuss what we mean by archaeological anthropology. Three, examine the methods of undertaking historical anthropology studies. Four, explore the shortcomings of historical anthropology. I think you have got that. Then we move to the last part of our discussion as far as sources of history is concerned, which is what we call linguistics. Linguistics as a source of history. By linguistics, we mean the scientific study of language aspects such as grammar patterns, the similarities and the differences between languages to find out if they are genetically related. For example, if you meet a Muchiga and you meet a Munyankole, there are some terms or words you will find a Muchiga uses, and that same word is being used by the Banyankole. So when you look at that, it brings you to the question, is there any relationship between these two people? And that is going to be brought by this aspect. So linguistics helps us to trace the origin of people using languages and even the relations. So it involves reconstructing the ancestral languages, classifying language families, and analyzing the sounds, the grammatical and the semantic shifts, often using the comparative method of understanding language history. At the end, you will get to know whether these people are related or not, whether they or moved away from the same place or not. So linguistics also help historians to find out to which language family a particular language belongs. And as they find that, they will find the relationship between societies. It acts as a crucial interdisciplinary source of history by analyzing language relationships, the evolution, vocabulary, so that they reconstruct the past, especially for cultures lacking written records. It also helps historians to map human migrations. I've already talked about that, to identify the cultural interactions and classify the language families. For example, when they talk of Bantu, the Bantu groups in Uganda, are there terminologies that are similar? Do those terminologies so that they came from the same place or not? Those are the things. It also shows the social developments over time. So that is it. So when you are using, therefore, the study of linguistics as a source of history helps the historian to know which groups of people had or shared a common origin and language. The good example I've already given is the Bantu group, which has more than 400 communities in East Africa, East, Central, and Southern Africa. So most of these communities recognize some words in each other's language, and therefore they can easily understand each other or one another. So that is something very, very important for us to know. Therefore, in summary, as far as the sources of history are concerned, we have talked about the oral tradition as a source of history. We have talked about the written records as a source of history. We have talked about archaeology as a source of history. We have talked of anthropology as a source of history. And we have talked about linguistics as a source of history. That means there are 5 sources of history that we have learned in the whole of these presentations. Now, I want to give you some questions about linguistics. Examine the significance of linguistics in historical studies. Number 2, what are the weaknesses of linguistics in history? How will you use linguistics to trace the peopling of Uganda? Then 4, expound with evidence the sources of historical studies. With that, we have closed the chapter or the unit on the sources of history. Therefore, with all that, I thank you. I encourage you to read more, to do more research, so that you are not limited to what I have presented, but you read and even go beyond what I have presented, so that you widen your knowledge and you become useful historian, a very objective historian, not subjective. Thank you and God bless you.